Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Halifax.
Thank you for the warm welcome from my colleagues. This is actually my first opportunity to rise in the House during debate, so I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to the voters of Halifax who voted me back with a very strong mandate to represent all the constituents in the riding. And for those trivia buffs here, political trivia buffs like the member for Winnipeg Centre, it's an interesting fun fact to know that in fact I was elected with more votes of any member since Robert Stanfield. Whoa. I know! Hey, that's not bad for a New Democrat in Atlantic Canada. Thank you. So I am here representing the constituents of Halifax, regardless of whether they voted for me or not. And speaking of those constituents, I have had a lot of contact from constituents since we started this debate in the House. Actually, in fact, since the hours after the rolling strikes began and the government announced in this House that they were going to introduce back-to-work legislation, I've had a lot of contact from constituents. And that's whose voice is missing here. We're doing a good job standing up here for the workers, standing up for Canadians, but their voices are missing. So, Madam Speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to bring their voices to this chamber, to this magnificent place, and actually share with you what they're saying in my riding. Some of them are postal workers, some of them are not, but they all care deeply about this issue. And I'll start with a letter I got from Thomas Beasley. And he wrote, "My name is Thomas Beasley and I'm a letter carrier and a 29-year employee of Canada Post in Halifax. I urge the honourable members here today to reject the legislation before you. Remove this unjust act that impedes the ability for our union and Canada Post to negotiate a fair agreement for both parties. Allow history to show that government allows collective bargaining to resolve issues and does not permit legislation to tip the scales and handcuff the rights of workers and labour in Canada. Let the record show that all parties here today work together to make the playing field level so that Canada Post is forced to negotiate in good faith. This has not been the case thus far. We, the workers, I, a letter carrier, we want to do our work. We want to deliver the mail. We as citizens of this great country want to deliver this mail. We did everything we could to ensure our service was maintained with as little disruption to the public as possible while attempting to force Canada Post to negotiate in good faith. They have hidden behind the promise of legislation and today hide behind an act of legislation. They caused the loss of service to our customers and now should not be allowed to hide behind the misleading information they are providing to our customers. Let nay be the vote that carries at the end of the debate. Let history show all parties are concerned about workers' rights. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Madam Speaker, I have another letter I received from a constituent named Scott Mason. He says, "I'm a mail carrier for Canada Post. I strongly oppose the back-to-work legislation because it gives the corporation a way out of bargaining in good faith." Madam Speaker, we're starting to see a theme here. Why should Canada Post negotiate when they know the government is going to side with them anyway? We started out with rolling strikes to put some pressure on the corporation and very little on the public. We do not have any problem with the public. As a matter of fact, we've been getting overwhelming support from the public. If we do not have the right to fair negotiations, what kind of future will we and our families have? What about future generations? It seems like we're going backwards. If the majority of the population is only making minimum wage, where will the economy be? The Prime Minister would be wise to think really hard about this situation because there's a lot of unions in this country with a lot of votes. Well, that's a good point. We're not asking for the moon, we just want a fair deal. We're ready and willing to deliver the mail and still are. Now, if the Prime Minister would legislate Canada Post to let us get back to doing our jobs, which many of us love, and make them negotiate, he would earn a lot of respect. Madam Speaker, this next letter is actually from someone in my riding who I know is not a postal worker. In fact, he's a scientist, but he wrote to me because he cares about this issue as well, and his name is Chris Micah, and he wrote, "A just and democratic society is one that knows how to hear and balance the voices, ideals, and legitimate concerns of all its citizens. The right to collective bargaining by unions representing working people are an essential component of how modern, progressive, democratic societies work. These rights were hard fought for and represent a significant triumph for citizens, not only of Canada, but also of nations throughout the world where the principles of civil society are respected. They ensure that working people have a right to be heard with respect to legitimate concerns relating to the conditions of their employment and the remuneration they receive. But they also represent something even more important: dignity. The dignity that is every person's birthright. Dignity to be respected as an individual, as a human being with fundamental rights, and not simply as a mechanical cog within an administrative or corporate machine. And these rights must also not be toothless. Where collective bargaining fails to achieve mutually acceptable consensus, unions and the members they represent must have the right to withdraw their services and strike for what they believe in. Without this capacity, collective bargaining pales in insignificance. Unions must be able to take a principled position on the picket lines, literally standing for what they believe. Except in demonstrably dire circumstances, this right to collectively bargain should not be abrogated by government. Forcing workers back to work needlessly muddies the waters of collective bargaining. It disenfranchises workers from the fundamental rights of every person to have a role in determining the conditions, circumstances, and remuneration under which they offer their services to an employer. I submit that in the case of the current lockout by the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, there is no dire threat to Canada of the sort that would warrant the federal government passing back-to-work legislation. I urge the Canadian government to respect the rights of workers, to respect the principles of collective bargaining, to respect the right of unions to undertake legal strike action, and to drop its plans to pass such legislation. Canadians from all walks of life are looking to see if this government intends to impose governance on its citizens or work in concert with them. This is the time to demonstrate good faith and show a commitment to respective civil society. I feel, Madam Speaker, like I actually couldn't say this better myself. People have written with really passionate letters, and it's a real privilege to be able to bring their voices to the floor. May I ask how much time I have left? Thank you. In the time I have left, I would like to read a little bit from Jim Guild in Halifax, and he wrote, "Any fair-minded parliamentarian would have to rise and speak forcefully against the legislation forcing postal workers back to work. Any law that so precipitously and unnecessarily takes away the democratic right of workers to lawfully withdraw their labor will be reprehensible. But this act is so flagrantly one-sided in favor of the employer, Canada Post, that it does discredit to even this Conservative government. And this is a government that most Canadians expect to be unfair and unreasonable. Not only is the legislation an attack on public sector workers, it's a disrespectful assault on the very public service upon which Canadians rely. This is particularly true for Canadians who live outside our urban areas. It's a slap in the faces of the very workers who created the Canada Post. The profits these past years have flowed directly to the Canadian government coffers, and it insults every new employee before they've even started working. This is the Prime Minister gift that keeps on taking. So I encourage any parliamentarian to do whatever they can to delay, if not prevent, the enactment of this short-sighted and mean-spirited legislation. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Those, as I said, are voices of people from my riding that I represent, and I think they have put it just beautifully. And I urge this government to start acting reasonably and take the locks off the doors and let the two parties negotiate and put an end to this lockout.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Etobicoke Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the Honourable Member for her comments, and I recognize her passion. However, her comments are misguided and reflect her party's focus on narrow interests and even narrow vision. Madam Speaker, we have heard from Canadians overwhelmingly that this government wants us to act on their behalf and expect us to because of the strong mandate that they have entrusted us with. Madam Speaker, we will not break faith with the Canadian people. Why can't the member opposite and her party join us in supporting the broader interests of all Canadians?
honourable member for Halifax.
Madam Speaker, I think that Carol Woodall from the riding of Halifax is the perfect answer to that question. She says to us on the NDP side, thanks for your support of postal workers who have exercised their legitimate rights to bargain for a fair collective agreement. It would be a grave disservice to postal workers for the government to interfere in the collective bargaining process. Here's the point. The parties should be left to work out their differences without government intervention. What is the emergency? Postal workers were willing and ready to deliver checks as they had done in past labour disputes during the 1990s. Madam Speaker, this is a lockout and nothing else, and it's time for them to cut the locks off.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Newton North Delta.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm kind of getting tired of hearing about special interests whenever it refers to working people across this country. This debate today is not about just unionized workers. This debate is about all workers. And if we want to talk about special interests, we could talk about a government that instead of telling Canada Post to open the doors so workers can go out and deliver the mail, what they do is they introduce legislation which introduces a lower salary than that offered by the Canada Post. Okay. So talk about special interest. Members across this aisle have a special interest, and that special interest is to attack working people. I would like to ask my colleague to make a comment.
The honourable member for Halifax.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I really appreciate what my colleague had to say. And in response, I'd actually like to bring up something that Leslie States from Halifax wrote to me that directly relates to this question. She says, postal workers have always wanted to continue to deliver the mail and have showed up daily to do so, only to be turned back at the door. I ask you, how can the government legislate us back to work when we have never chosen to leave work or strike? I urge you to do what you can to squash this motion, have us legislated back to work, and instead motion that Canada Post be ordered to come back to the bargaining table to work on a fair and collective contract. We employees are not trying to be difficult or impede or inconvenience the Canadian public by demanding that we be treated fairly and with respect, and along with the help of the NDP and others in the House that realize this is wrong, we will continue to fight for justice.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Newmarket, Aurora.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I find it very interesting that my colleague has been reading letters from her constituents and talking about the postal strike. I would like to read something from a constituent of mine who is an employer in the area, and he says, as a business owner in your constituency, I am part of an industry that employs over 58,000 Canadians, and when you consider family members relying on those employees, has an impact on some 150,000 Canadians in total. What he says to me is, as you can appreciate, in addition to our loss of business, the impact on the cash flow for all small business is an extreme hardship we can ill afford to face in these challenging times. So my question to the honourable member is, what does she say to 150,000 Canadians who are in danger, in threat of losing their livelihood?
The honourable member for Halifax.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for her question, and I certainly hope her constituent is watching right now, because I'd like him to understand that, in fact, it is her party and her government that has put the locks on the doors. The two parties are willing to negotiate, that the postal workers have said, we'll go back to the table, we'll bargain, but it is their government who put the locks on the doors, and so I hope that all the businesses in her riding realize that it's, in fact, her responsibility and that the losses that they're suffering are a result of her party's actions. Thank you.